So if you've ever taken a standardized test, you've probably heard of an analogy. The structure is something like A is to B as X is to Y. They're pretty common on the SATs. And then on the other hand, I'm sure you've used a metaphor. So life is like a box of chocolates, or my roommate is a pig. Those are both metaphors. They're words that we use to communicate something else. But they're actually the same thing. So an analogy and a metaphor are two ways of using comparison to help an audience understand something that they don't know by comparing them to something that they do know. Why we don't use them together in public language, I don't know. But what we're going to discuss today is how to effectively use an analogy, the difference between an analogy and a metaphor and why you need to know that, and then why analogies are so effective for public speakers. My name is Lee Pierce. I'm a visiting assistant professor at the Department of Communication at SUNY Geneseo, and we're about to learn all about analogies. So what is an analogy?
No to everything you both said. Weddings are like little girls' tea parties, except the women are the stuffed animals, the men are making them talk, and they're not drinking tea. They're drinking antiquated gender roles.
Somebody tell Britta what an analogy is.
I know what it is. It's like a thought with another thought's hat on.
So let's look at the basic structure of an analogy, which is also the basic structure of a metaphor. So you essentially have two things. One is something that you know about, and the other is something you don't know about. And in public speaking, the thing you don't know about is the point of the speech. So if I'm giving a toast for my best friend, the best friend is the thing that you don't know about. If I'm giving an intro speech about myself, I'm the thing that you don't know about. If I'm writing a report on a book, the book is the thing that you don't know about. So that's the topic typically of the speech. And to help people understand the topic, to understand your perspective on it, you use an analogy or a metaphor so you can compare the thing people don't know to the thing that they do. So let's take the basic metaphor / analogy. Jonathan is a tiger. Jonathan is the unknown idea. I don't know who Jonathan is. I just found this on the internet. So Jonathan is the thing we don't know about. But we know about tigers, or at least we think we do, right? So if we say Jonathan is a tiger or Jonathan is like a tiger, what does that mean? Does that mean he's furry and has stripes and claws? Does it mean he naps a lot? Does it mean he's a carnivore? We don't know. And this is the difference between a metaphor and an analogy. In a metaphor, the idea is already so well circulated that you know the difference. So when I say my roommate is like a pig, you know it means she's messy because we circulate that all the time. However, if I say, my roommate, they're like a dump truck. It's like, okay, so they're dirty or big. What are you trying to say? Then I give you the details. Well, they're coming around all hours of the night. It'll be 3 a.m. and I'm asleep in my bed and all of a sudden crash and I hear these loud noises and these lights are shining in my window and things are, clamping around. And then you're like, oh, okay. Your roommate is like a dump truck because they're disruptive. And so now the wheels start to turn, right? So analogies and metaphors have the same structure, which is they have the unknown topic. We call that the tenor. So like in music, the tenor is the bottom part of the music. The tenor in an analogy is the unknown idea. It's the thing you're talking about. Then we have this other idea, tiger, dump truck, pig, whatever. And that's called the vehicle because it literally drives the idea into the speech. So you've taken one thing's hat and put it on the other thing. So dump truck, the idea is disruptive, and now I'm gonna transfer it to my roommate. Pig equals messy, I'm gonna transfer it to my roommate. And that's pretty much all there is. Unknown vehicle, or tenor, right? The known vehicle, which drives in and drops off the idea, and then the idea which is transferred from something we do know to something that we don't know. And there you have an analogy. And the only difference between an analogy is that we don't know what the idea is, so we have to describe the vehicle. But then in a metaphor, we already know, so they're shorter. You can use both in a speech. Metaphors happen a lot faster because the audience immediately understands your point. Analogies take a little bit longer to set up, but they're more effective in some ways because the audience really gets to participate in what's happening. Also, just because your audience knows the point of the metaphor, right? So if you say, my brother is a lot like Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, the audience might know who Jon Snow from Game of Thrones is, but they don't know exactly the idea that you're trying to communicate. Is your brother hot? Is your brother really ethical? Is your brother an adorable person? I mean, we don't know. So even though the metaphor kind of works because the audience understands it, you still have to explain what are the characteristics or behaviors of Jon Snow that you want to transfer onto your brother, and then the idea gets transferred. By the way, my brother is nothing like Jon Snow. My brother is an asshole. Jon Snow is adorable. So that's the basic structure, and if you follow the structure, you will have a very effective analogies. What usually happens though is when people give analogies in speeches, either they don't take long enough, so they kind of treat them like metaphors. You know, Jon Snow is so nice. My brother's nothing like Jon Snow. He's an asshole. Is a great example of a failed analogy because there's no development. So that's one thing people do wrong. The other thing people do wrong is that they start giving us all of these details about the metaphor. Jon Snow does this. And by the way, I don't even watch Game of Thrones. I don't even know where this came from, but I think it's working. So, you know, Jon Snow does this. He said this. He did this thing on a dragon. He did this thing with a sword. He had this lady friend. And it's like, I'm learning a lot about Jon Snow, but what am I supposed to get about your brother again? So this is a case where we've gotten so dependent on developing the details that we've forgotten the idea. And this happens a lot, and it really ruins the analogy. So here's an example from Fresh Prince, and let's look at where Uncle Phil goes wrong with his analogy.
Morning, Dad.
Morning, son.
Hey, look, Uncle Phil, check it out. Can I talk to you for a second?
Do you have to?
Come on, Uncle Phil, this is serious, man. I need to talk to you about, cars.
Cars? Oh, cars. Yeah, well, I guess it is about time that you and I started talking about cars. Okay. Oh, God. This car isn't in trouble, is it?
Oh, no. Never been off the lot, far as I could tell.
Look, Will, driving is serious business. Well, these days, you got to think about safety. You never want to go for a ride in a car without your seatbelt. And use your brakes. Don't floor it. Because then you throw a rod, you flood your carburetor, you crack your block. You understand what I'm saying?
Nah, man.
No sex before marriage.
So what happened? So Uncle Phil is trying to talk about a sensitive topic, and Will brings it up, cars. So cars are the known vehicle, literally, right? We know about cars. The unknown vehicle, right, the sensitive subject that Will doesn't really want to talk about is sex. And so they're going to use cars to describe what needs to be understood and drive it in and transfer it onto sex. But we're never going to talk about sex, right? And this is the key to a really stellar analogy. You only describe the known vehicle, right? I never talk about my brother. I only talk about Jon Snow. And then as I'm describing these things, the audience makes the transfer. And that's really important because then the audience is participating in the speech, even if they're sitting there. But Uncle Phil goes awry because instead of focusing on the idea that he wants to communicate, he starts talking about all this car stuff like cracked blocks and radiators and like who knows. And so then at the end, when he says, "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Will's like, "No." Because what happened is he was really trying to communicate a bunch of stuff, right? In the very beginning when he talks about taking it slow and taking it easy, you think he's kind of talking about preventing heartbreak or maybe even using protection. But then later, when he starts talking about crack your radiator and your block, then we don't kind of know what's going on. Like maybe there's a heartbreak or somebody's getting pregnant. I don't know, things get real weird. And then it turns out it was about abstinence. What? But none of those details about the car had anything to do with abstinence. So at the end, the analogy has totally failed and Will is just as confused as he was when they started. So when you use analogies in your speech, it's pretty simple. Follow the basic formula, right? Unknown vehicle is the topic. Known vehicle is the thing you're going to describe. And you choose the details of the known vehicle to drive in the idea that you want to transfer. The point is not to describe cars. The point is to choose details about cars so that the audience goes, oh, I get it about sex. And at the end of this video, I'm going to post a link to a really awesome analogy comparing, sexual consent to tea, which I'm sure you've heard before, but if you haven't seen this video, it's a great example of a basic, well-done analogy. So that's one piece of advice. The other piece of advice is to take your time. Analogies are like stories. They require detail and development. You're going to need 30 or 45 seconds. So if your analogy is only 5 seconds or 10 seconds long, it's basically a metaphor. It's fine to have one, but don't assume it's going to do the work that an analogy will do. And the last piece of advice for an analogy is it really has to be detailed to the point of absurdity, right? So not the way that Uncle Phil is absurd, but you have to really focus on the concrete details. Seatbelts, crack your block, carburetor, radiator, where you park. I mean, you have to really see the car and describe the parts of it that matter for the analogy. I always tell students, if you come up with a great analogy, go do a Google search for the thing that you're describing and read about what that's like. So, you remember the honey badger YouTube thing, which is like,
here's a house full of bees. You think the honey badger cares? It doesn't give a shit. The honey badger doesn't care. It's getting stung like 1,000 times. It doesn't give a shit. It's hungry.
So if I stand up and I'm like, my friend is just like a honey badger because she does not give a shit. That's fine. It works as a metaphor. It's cute. But if you really want it to work as an analogy, you have to describe what honey badgers do that makes them not give a shit. And you may not know. You're like, well, I like this metaphor, but I don't know how honey badgers behave. You got to read about honey badgers. You got to detail how honey badgers burrow and how they treat their mates and what they do with their young and all this stuff. Because as you do that, I, the audience member, am going, oh, that's what your friend is like. So that's how it works. So there you have it. Basic structure of an analogy, best practices for putting them together. And remember, metaphors and analogies are not the same thing. And the key to a great analogy is you have to have so much detail that it's almost ridiculous. Feel free to leave questions in the comments, and good luck public speaking.